that we want to kind of direct you on kind of how to do. So right now, you could have a different view in Zoom right now. You could have speaker view or you could have grid view. When it's fun like this to have the grid view because you see everybody. But when Jack starts to share his screen, you're going to want to kind of pin him and make sure that you either have it on speaker view so that you see whoever's speaking at the time, which is what I recommend, or pin it to John so that you see what's going on his screen. Good morning, wherever you may be. On behalf of Claremont College and the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement, I wanted to take just a quick moment and wish you all good health during this global crisis. The college is excited to put together a series of robust virtual programs for our alumni and parents. Just so you all are aware, we will be sending an email every Monday, plus advertising these programs on alumni and parent website, college social media accounts. Just remember to follow Claremont McKenna College, CMC Alumni and Families, the new CMC Community private Facebook group, so that you can continue to see everything that we do. My name is Evan Rutter. I've sent you a number of emails over the last 7 years. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Alumni and Parent Engagement, also an alumnus of the college. And it's my pleasure to host really our first virtual session with faculty for alumni and parents. Today, we're thrilled to have Professor Jack Pitney, the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Politics at CMC, to discuss election 2020 and, of course, the effects COVID-19 may have on it. Professor Pitney will speak and share some slides, and then we'll go to Q&A. For the question and answer portion, there are, if you find on the right side when you have your chat feature open, there are a number of different symbols you can put in. So if you end up with a thumbs up or a hand clap or something during the Q&A portion, I will actually go to you and unmute you and call on you for your question. So I'll do a little bit of a reminder about that when Professor Pitney is finished, and then we will go into the Q&A portion from that. So without further ado, I turn it over to Professor Pitney.
Thank you all. Okay, am I muted?
No, you're good to go.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm getting nods. Okay, good. Okay, I'm very happy to be here, not under these circumstances, but it's great to see a lot of former students and friends and parents and various people connected with CMC. First thing I want to talk about today is a topic that has surprised me how often it's come up. Literally, when one of my last visits to a supermarket before this started, I actually went this morning too, a woman came up to me very nervous asking, can the president cancel the election? Is he just going to cancel the election and that will be it? And I can assure everybody that's not going to happen. We're going to review some stuff you might even remember from Gov 20. That is the Constitution. Now, it is true, and Candace can talk about this a little later because she's directly involved. Some states have indeed postponed primary elections. In fact, that's becoming more and more common. I heard a number of people from New York. They've postponed the primary election. California, we already had it just before. And that is totally within the power of states to do. But the question is, can a president unilaterally cancel or postpone a general election? And the answer is no. Can everybody see the screen? Okay, it should say remarks to CMC. Okay, good. Here's the deal, as Joe Biden would say. The Constitution sets terms of office and no exceptions. The term of the president and vice president will end at noon on January 20th, period. The terms of members of Congress, terms of House members and senators whose terms expire this year will be up on January 3rd. And that's that. It is possible that Congress could postpone the November election, but only by a little only by a short period of time, only by a couple of weeks at most, because the electors have to vote. They have to choose the electors. And in order for the electors to meet, for the votes to be counted, all this has to transpire before the terms end in January. So again, there can't be a cancellation of the election, but there can be a slight delay. Instead of early November, it could be mid-November, but not much later. So that's not a realistic concern under the Constitution. But hypothetically, let's say the election didn't happen for some reason. Well, the terms still end. Trump cannot unilaterally extend his term of office. Members of Congress can't extend their term of office. So if something happened and there was no election for some reason, the House would be depopulated. We wouldn't have a president. So next in line is the president pro tem of the Senate. After all, 2/3 of the Senate would still be there. Currently, the president pro tem of the Senate is Chuck Grassley. But if we have a situation where there isn't an election and the senators who were up in 2020 find their terms have ended, we could actually end up with the Democratic majority in the remainder of the Senate. And it's possible that the acting president could be Pat Leahy, whom you may remember from his cameos in all the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. Okay, now we're way out in the blue. We're way out in the science fiction. That's almost certainly not going to happen. We are going to have an election. Realistically, what can Congress do? Can Congress require mail ballots? Yes, that's perfectly within the power of Congress to do so, to regulate the forms of elections to Congress. The question is whether Congress would do so. There's a lot of opposition on the Republican side. President Trump was quoted as saying, well, if some of the stuff the Democrats wanted was in the stimulus bill, we'd never elect another Republican. So there's a lot of resistance to a federal requirement for mail ballots, but a number of states are already moving in that direction. So we're going to have a lot of voting by mail in November. The election is going to take place. The question is, what kind of turnout are we going to see? Very much an open question. We just don't know. A lot of uncertainty here. Another question not regulated by federal law, but by party rules, the conventions. Are we going to have conventions on time and in the usual manner? And Joe Biden was recently quoted as saying he very much doubted it. At very least, we're likely to see a delay in one or both of the conventions. Democrats are talking about moving it to August. Here's the problem. If you've ever been involved with a national convention, these are enormously huge and complicated events, and you just can't shift it from one date to another or from one city to another. So we don't know how that's going to work out. People are talking about maybe having a virtual convention. Just multiply what we're doing now by a couple of hundred, and that you get a sense of how complicated that would be. Fortunately, for the legitimacy of the process, the conventions themselves no longer are really decision-making bodies. They exist mostly to ratify the results of the primaries and caucuses. So it isn't like the old days in the old movie The Best Man, where you had a lot of wheeling and dealing and decision-making at the convention. So it really isn't going to change substantively the outcome of the nomination process if they have to hold the conventions by electronic device. Exactly how that works, your guess is as good as mine. It's kind of like what we're doing in classrooms. We're making it up as we go along. This will be a fascinating time to be studying the election. Andy Bush and I are writing a book about the 2020 election. We have no idea what we're going to title it because we don't know what the outcome is going to be and we don't know how it's going to play out. So for the rest of this hour, we're going to be talking a lot about a lot of uncertainty. Now let me scroll down, and campaign operations are greatly affected by this. For the time being, candidates can't campaign in the usual way. Trump loves the huge rallies. Well, he can't have them anymore. For the time being, the functional equivalent for him staying in the public eye consists of his daily press conferences. And in a couple of minutes, we'll talk about the possible effects of those press conferences. Joe Biden is having difficulty staying in the public eye. He's broadcasting from his home. That's getting some attention. He's getting some airtime on the news with interviews, but nothing like what the president's getting, and that's understandable in a national crisis. But a couple of things are worth noting. Number one, Trump started the campaign with an enormous financial advantage. He didn't have any serious competition in the primaries, was able to save his resources for the general, and when a president enters a room, it fills up with money. Presidents are always able to raise a great deal of money, and that was the case here. In the New York Times article, you can see if you combine Trump's fundraising haul with the RNC, $225 million for the Trump reelection campaign in the RNC, Democrats, and Biden and the DNC, $20 million. And again, to quote Joe Biden, here's the deal. Really hard to raise money. You're all watching what's happening in the financial world. People are losing their jobs. The stock market has gyrated. It's, some days are pretty good, but it's lost a great deal of value. That's going to make it tremendously difficult to raise additional funds. So that puts the Democrats at a substantial financial disadvantage. You may have heard Michael Bloomberg promised to have a massive independent spending operation, regardless of whether he was the nominee. Unfortunately for the Democrats, he's backtracked on that. He's going to make a substantial contribution to the Democratic National Committee, but nothing on the order of what he was previously talking about. Some of the Democratic super PACs are trying to step up, but overall, the campaign finance picture does seem to benefit Trump and the Republicans. So that's one advantage that the president has. Another is the internet. He made extremely effective use of social media in the 2016 election. Has been very active, as the article here indicates. Trump has 75 million Twitter followers, 1.7 million Facebook fans. The other day he said he was #1 in Facebook. Actually, that's Barack Obama, but he ranks up there. He does rank up there, that's for sure. And I'm sorry, Trump has 28 million Facebook fans. And that gives him an advantage. Now, the thing about social media is, and this is very consistent with Trump's approach, it's not reaching out to a broad spectrum of the electorate, but rather it's a way of motivating his own base. That enabled him to get elected in 2016, and the Trump people are counting on that to put him over the edge in 2020. In a minute, we'll talk about the prospects for that. But that's another disadvantage for the Democrats. A third disadvantage is Bernie Sanders is still in the race. Like Joe Biden, he is very limited in what he can do by way of campaigning. There's a widespread perception among the Democrats that Biden is the de facto nominee. But Sanders persists in the race, and that could cause some difficulty for Biden in the weeks ahead, particularly if Sanders resumes his criticism of Biden. As the president likes to say, we'll see what happens. Okay, let's talk about, I want to spend a good deal of time talking about the state of the race. You have probably seen that the president has gotten a bump in approval. In the past few weeks, depending on the poll, his approval rating has gone up by a few points. Let's see if I can get this here. This is an average done by the website 538. And as of this morning, his average disapproval is 50%, average approval is 45.7. By presidential standards, that's not terrific. And as you can see, there hasn't been a lot of variation in either number since 2018. But still, we have seen a measurable increase in recent weeks, from a low of 42.8 approval up to 45. And Republicans are taking heart from that. Democrats are being a little nervous. Some background in this. In times of national crisis, there is a rally around the flag effect. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen most of the time. We saw this in the early days of the Second World War. Those were the early days of polling. Saw it at the end of the war, tremendous upsurge in support for the president after the nuclear bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Surge of support for President Kennedy at the Bay of Pigs, which is quite telling because the Bay of Pigs, as you know, was a disaster, but his numbers went up. And Kennedy was a little perplexed by that. But again, people tend to rally around the flag in a crisis. One exception to this was, for those of you of a certain age, 1968, the Pueblo. North Koreans seized a U.S. surveillance ship off the coast of North Korea. And there wasn't a surge of support, but that occurred right in the middle of the Vietnam War. And so that had exhausted the American public's desire to rally around the flag. So that's kind of a one-off. Very dramatic surge in support with 9/11. Just before 9/11, Bush's support was only a few points higher than Trump's is right now. And you can see from the graph here what happened. It went up to 86, hitting a high of 90%. That's Truman level. And this is, by the way, was before commencement of American military operations in Afghanistan. So it wasn't a result of the short-term success there. But you can see in the last even remotely comparable crisis, there was a rally effect, but the rally effect was far greater than what we've seen in recent days. Now, as you know, Bush's numbers went way down. The rally effect didn't last. Rally effects seldom do. But a question is, why is Trump's rally effect as modest as it is? And the answer is polarization. In recent years, people have dug into their partisan trenches. Republicans support Trump. Democrats strongly oppose Trump. And as you can see with the approval rating that I showed you, really not a great deal of movement. Trump's disapproval rating has stayed pretty steady, around 50%, give or take a few points. The approval rating has stayed in the low to mid 40s, pretty much with a couple of exceptions. So people are really, really dug in on Trump. Now, some of this is broader polarization. We saw this during the Obama years as well. But as Andy Bush and I pointed out in our last book, Trump's strategy is to appeal to the base. His political strategy is not to attempt really to reach out to Democrats, but to motivate Republicans to get to the polls. And that has shaped his entire communication strategy. If you read what he's saying on Twitter and social media, it tends to be pretty partisan, remarkably partisan for a president in time of crisis. So that's something to that's something to remember as this unfolds, which gets to the fall campaign. Another remarkable aspect of this entire crisis, and I rank among the older people in this session, so I have some historical memory here that some folks may not have. It is very unusual in the early days of a crisis like this for reactions on either side to be as partisan as they are. As you can see from this tweet from today, Trump campaign told surrogates to paint Biden as the opposition. You did not see this in the days after 9/11. In fact, after Bush gave his speech to a joint meeting of Congress, there's a picture of then Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle hugging him. And there was a great deal of bipartisanship rallying around Bush. And remember, Bush was a fairly divisive figure in 2000 and 2001. A lot of you remember the controversy surrounding the election, the hanging chads in Florida, and there were a lot of Democrats who raised questions about his legitimacy as president. But with 9/11, that went away for a while. Keyword is for a while. Hadn't happened this time. Almost immediately, you have a lot of partisan attacks, again, on both sides. The president is talking about painting Biden as the opposition. We'll be seeing those ads very shortly. You've seen a lot of his tweets. In fact, just this morning, he tweeted about crying Chuck Schumer, and when he signed the stimulus bill, he refused to invite either Schumer or Nancy Pelosi. Quite remarkable. And on the Democratic side, the attacks on Trump are pretty harsh, and they're very specifically about this crisis. Again, very, very unusual. Let's see if we can play the social media ad that Biden is running. Okay, we're having a little trouble with that, but you can see from the tweet itself, it's time for Donald Trump to do his job, so here's able to do that. There's lives are at stake. A lot of very direct criticism of the president's handling of coronavirus in very, very stark terms. Something that, again, we just did not see in the early days of 9/11, didn't see it after the Cuban Missile Crisis, certainly didn't see it after Pearl Harbor. Quite remarkable and a foreshadowing of how the campaign is going to play out. Okay, the question is, what's going to happen? Okay, confession, and some of you already know this. Elections are sometimes hard to predict. And just before the 2016 election, I gave a talk at the Ath, and people were there remembering, I went through an elaborate explanation of why Hillary Clinton was going to win. As you know, it turned out differently. She did, in fact, win the popular vote by actually a fairly substantial margin, but the electoral vote took some unusual bounces, and Trump was elected. So even under normal circumstances, you have to be cautious about election predictions, and these are far from normal circumstances. So what decides the election? And that is state of the economy. Some very bad economic news lately. Projections of GDP aren't great, and GDP tends to be a predictor of presidential outcomes. So the political scientist Alan Abramowitz literally has a formula for predicting elections based on the second quarter growth or shrinkage of GDP and the president's net approval rating in late June. And as you can see from this chart, the likely outcomes for Trump are not good. He's been running about -10. Even with his recent bump in the polls, he's actually closer to -10 than -5. And the projection for second quarter GDP is literally off the chart, and I mean that in a bad way. There's some projection it could be way, way lower than -5%. So if that is the case, we're looking at a projection of Trump 144 electoral votes, 270 needed to win. So if the election is decided simply on the state of the economy in the second quarter, Trump's going to lose. However, lots of uncertainty. So let me, before we shift to a discussion, talk about various kinds of uncertainty. Number one, how are people going to judge his handling of coronavirus? Are they going to grade him on a curve? That remains to be seen. The president indicated the other day that if the death toll is less than 200,000, that will count as something as a victory. Well, if Americans see it as anywhere remotely the same way, he could end up getting reasonably good marks on the crisis, and that could help him in the election. Number two, he's on the air every day. He may well be on the air every day, right through the summer at least. And a lot of Americans are watching and approving of what they see. If you're on social media, you probably hear a lot of criticism of the president's comments, but the reactions of ordinary voters are often not the same as those of the people who comment on social media. That works to his advantage. We already saw the president has tremendous fundraising advantage, tremendous social media advantage, and that's going to work to his benefit, particularly when it gets to mobilizing voters in the states. We don't know what turnout is going to be. A lot of votes are going to be cast by mail, but in some cases, some states aren't going to have widespread mail balloting, and that could greatly depress turnout. That might help, could help the Republicans. So this is a formula based on quote unquote normal conditions, but the conditions of this election are far from normal. And a couple of other things could have an impact. Some people say, well, who's Biden going to pick as vice president? You know, my top candidate, you know, being stag loyalist, would be a certain governor of Montana. However, I doubt that the governor of Montana is going to be the running mate, in part because he's already promised to name a woman. So there's a short list of candidates. The most important thing he has to consider out of his list of candidates is this. And Jake Petzold wrote a tremendous senior thesis a few years back on this topic. In picking a vice president, there's really only one thing that matters, and that is this person ready to become president on day one? That's really the thing that matters most. Ideological balance, geographic balance, we already know he's going to have gender balance. These things might help a little at the margins, but the important thing is qualification, because this is the most important decision that a potential president will make. And it's especially important given Joe Biden's age. So people are going to be paying perhaps more attention to the vice presidential selection than they would otherwise. It would probably tend to favor people who have run for president before. This would give a boost to Kamala Harris or Amy Klobuchar, if only because we know how they behave on the campaign trail. Biden probably has a substantial oppo file on both of them already. So they would be top of the list. There's been some discussion of other potential vice presidential candidates, and we can talk about that later. But anyway, we've gone past 9:30. You wanted to leave close to half an hour for Q&A. So with that, I will yield the floor for questions.
All right, thank you, Jack. If you would turn off your screen sharing, then I can look at who's asking a question. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, all on the right chat panel, there's a series of little buttons down below. Yes, no, there's more, there's thumbs up, thumbs down, hands clapping. If you have a question, just tap one of those and I'll come to you and I'll unmute you and you can introduce yourself, name, class year, and your question. And I will say, I'm not sure if you saw, Jack, that the DNC has postponed the convention to August 17th.
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to comment on that while we wait for a question.
Well, a big question in political science is, does a later convention benefit a political party, that it's closer to the decision day? Probably does end up working to the Democrats' benefit because a lot of votes will be cast early by mail, and it will be fairly soon after the Democratic convention. It will be an opportunity for the Democrats to get their message out. The big question, of course, is what the format will be. And again, at this point, nobody really knows.
Awesome. I'm going to turn it over to Amy Berg. Amy, I'm unmuting you now.
Great. Thanks so much. This is really interesting. I'm Amy Berg. I'm class of '08. I live in Providence, Rhode Island. I was just wondering whether I understand why, under normal circumstances, people might think that vote by mail favors Democrats. But I'm wondering, given that older people are tending more and more to predominantly vote Republican, whether it's to Republicans' advantage to increase vote by mail, since that might make it more possible for older people to vote. Do you think that's a factor here, given that they're more vulnerable?
It's a great question. Again, an uncertainty. We just don't know how many, I'm of an age where I can say this. We don't know how many older people will be incapacitated. That could be a substantial factor in the election, particularly if there's a second wave of coronavirus in the fall. That could have an impact on turnout, even the sending in of mail ballots. The thing is, older people already vote. If you're of a certain age, you're just, damn it, you're going to vote. And it's not like that with younger people. But you're quite right. And, as a philosopher, you're very familiar with the world of epistemic uncertainty. There's a substantial amount of doubt about the outcome, doubt about turnout. Again, my hunch is that higher turnout will probably tend to benefit Democrats, but there are a lot of asterisks next to that assumption.
Great. We have a question from Mark Schwartz. Mark, I'm going to unmute you and I'll let you ask your question.
Thank you. I'm wondering, with the change in the administration's shelter-in-place recommendations, if the president could potentially extend it for longer than is medically necessary to kind of help him in the polls or the election, that keeping people nervous helps him stay president and get reelected.
Another great question. The issue is whether concern about coronavirus helps or hurts. And you could easily see it cutting both ways. If we get to the fall and people are still nervous, they might say, maybe Trump hasn't done a great job. Also, very important to know, and this is goes beyond election procedure to more, again, this will make for great Gov20 material, how little power Trump really has over quarantines. It's almost entirely at the state level. The shelter in place in California, New York, other states, that's the governors. And that gets to the limitations on federal power, the power of the states under the 10th Amendment, a broad range of police powers. Now, conceivably, and again, legal scholars differ on that, and I'll defer to any attorney. I know we have attorneys in the chat. I'll defer to you, but my understanding is there's some question about the president's authority to curb interstate travel, at least constitutional authority. Over the weekend, he was talking about maybe quarantining the state of New York. Well, even if the president did sort of have legal authority to do that, anybody familiar with the roads in New York State would realize that was totally impractical. Just look at a road map of the state of New York. There's so many roads leading into and out of New York State. You couldn't possibly enforce a statewide quarantine. So really, when we're, that involved interstate travel. So really, when you're talking about shelter in place, you're talking about governors. And for November, one thing to watch is the different experiences of different states. This could really have an impact on how people perceive the success or failure of different governors. And unfortunately, some states are going to have much higher problems than others.
And we have a question from Ada Hand. Ada, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question.
Well, thanks. Trump is getting unlimited TV time with the daily press conferences. Is there any way that the demand for equal time could be accomplished for Biden?
A great question. Equal time, it doesn't apply to regular news coverage. So when we're talking about equal time, there used to be the fairness doctrine that went out of existence in the 1980s. Something I talk about in the politics of journalism. And when it comes to presidential activities, things that are clearly related to the president's duties, there's no obligation to provide equal time. As the election gets closer, just as a matter of practice in journalism, I would expect that the media will start to give more airtime to Biden. But inevitably, Trump is going to have a big advantage there. Now, the question is, how are people going to perceive his performance? Lately, his mere presence on television has seemed to have helped him. But the election gets closer. Perhaps things, if God forbid, things don't really go well with the crisis, people might have a very different perception of what they see on the screen. So his advantage might diminish as a result of reality intruding.
Jack, Jade Tremblay has asked that I pose this question to you. What do you think the impact of the virus on the census and redistricting later will be?
Pretty bad. People can easily answer the census online. I did so a couple of weeks ago. You have a lot of people filling out forms by mail, but in order to complete the census, you need census takers going out. You need people willing, in some cases, to open their doors. I think it's a terrific question to which nobody really knows the answer, but the possibility of an undercount is much greater now than it was even a couple of months ago.
All right, next up is Alan Delsman. Alan, you have the floor.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be part of this. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm just curious if you would comment, please, on how we get so much focus on Trump's ratings, but congressional ratings are almost absent from news reporting. The last time I checked, they were at 17, up from 12. It seems that they're getting a pass in the news for their lack of participation in, I'm not speaking directly about this crisis, but over the past couple of years. Why is Congress's responsibility sort of getting a pass here?
Congress almost always has bad approval ratings. There was a brief bump after 9/11. The ratings have actually gone up some, as you mentioned, in recent days. But as an institution, Congress almost always, in the past couple of decades, has had low ratings. And those ratings really don't have any impact on election outcomes. The cliche is still true. People hate Congress and love their member of Congress. Re-election rates have remained fairly high, even in those years in which there was considerable turnover. A lot of the turnover happened in places where there were open seats. One of which is in Texas, and it's very. I think we're all very hopeful that a CMC alum will win an open seat in Texas. I am, of course, speaking of our own Candace Valenzuela. Okay, all right. I shamelessly worked in a commercial there.
And Candace is actually our next question. Candace?
Thank you so much for doing this, Professor Pitney. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I was hoping to be at Alumni Week, but this is a wonderful substitution. So this is a completely uninterested or unself-interested question, but I was wondering what that wealth disparity between the RNC and Trump and the DNC and Dems does to down ballot races.
It doesn't help, but
Jack,
as Michael Bloomberg, I'm sorry?
Can you repeat the question?
Really?
It's in here.
She was asking about the, totally disinterested here about the party wealth disparity and how it affects down ballot races, perchance elections to Congress. It certainly doesn't help the Democrats. However, money by itself does not decide elections. And if anybody believes that money itself buys elections, I have two words for you: Michael Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg spent $1 gazillion and, did horribly because as soon as people actually saw him live, as opposed to in his commercials, they went, ah! He just did not do well. Here in California, those who remember the 2010 election, Meg Whitman spent an enormous amount of money and lost handily to Jerry Brown. So even though it is an obstacle for Democrats, it is an obstacle that Democrats can overcome. If there is a broadly favorable environment for Democrats in the fall, I would expect that they would still do very, very well in elections for the House of Representatives. We've by the way, had a couple of senior theses over the years predicting that Texas would eventually turn blue. And that seems to be the case, particularly Candace in your district, which is trending in the Democratic direction very, very rapidly. There are forecasts just today, Larry Sabato at the University of Virginia now has control of the Senate as a toss-up. Originally looked as if it was going to be a lock for the Republicans to maintain control of the Senate. But there are several seats that seem to be working in the Democrats' advantage. It looks, I'll defer to Laura on this, but it looks like Martha McSally is going to lose to Mark Kelly in Arizona. Cory Gardner is in trouble in Colorado. Susan Collins in Maine. Even Joni Ernst in Iowa could have a very competitive race. So it's tight, but there's a possibility Democrats could take the Senate too.
Thank you. Next up, we have Art Dodd. Art, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, good morning, Jack. As a California resident, we're used to dealing with disasters, so I'd be curious what predictions you might have for what you might like to see for a new normal or a return to what things normal would you like to see?
Great question. I know disaster. As a lot of you know, I lost my house in a mudslide some years back, so I genuinely empathize for people who are suffering in natural disasters. The big issue in California, it's not going to be back to normal, even aside from the health issues, will be our budget. Here in California, we have a highly progressive tax system, and a lot of people say that's a great thing. But the problem with a highly progressive tax system is this: when the stock market plummets, our revenues plummet. And we're going to have a huge problem balancing the budget at least for the next couple of fiscal years. We do have a rainy day fund. It's raining, but that rainy day fund, I suspect, will be depleted pretty rapidly. So the governor and the state legislature are going to have some very, very, very difficult choices ahead. And given that we can't print money, unlike the federal government, the choice is either cut spending or raise taxes. That's it. Those are the only two things we can do. And I wish there were a silver bullet where we could resolve that fiscal issue painlessly, but there isn't. So the watchword in California government for the next couple of years at least will be like Mr. T said in Rocky III, pain. I wish I had a more uplifting answer to your question, but it's going to be very difficult. Now, difficult decisions often give an opportunity to the out party. Unfortunately for the Republicans, they've had a really rough time in California, have not had strong candidates, and the Democrats have super majorities in both chambers of the legislature. That doesn't look as if it's going to change.
Another question from Jay Tremblay, and that is your thoughts on the impact of digital ads, specifically as Trump is buying YouTube pages on Election Day.
Yeah, and this is a great question. As I mentioned on Twitter, a lot of it, a lot of the social media activity consists of mobilizing the base, motivating people who are already inclined to vote for you. Fascinating thing happened in 2016, and this is related to the Russian interference. Some of what the Russians did was designed to demobilize Hillary Clinton supporters, to talk about, to attack Hillary Clinton, not so much to boost Donald Trump, but through disguised accounts, raise questions about her record on various issues, and it may have had some effect in key states. We don't know whether it was sufficient to change the outcome of the election, but it may have changed some votes. We also know, and the FBI has warned about this, the Russians are interfering in this election again, but they're going to be a lot cleverer about it. In 2016, some of the Russian ads were comical, featuring spelling errors. You know, they must have had the B team in the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, because you could immediately spot some of the Russian ads, but they've gotten better at it. So that's going to be a huge problem. Russian social media ads designed to demobilize the electorate.
Thank you, Jack. And a reminder, if anyone wants to raise their hand, and feel free to do so. Also put their question in the chat and I will get over to you quickly. Alan Delsman, I had you on the list for a potential question. Alan, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a post-election question. If Trump were to win but lose the popular vote by a substantial margin, 5 or 6 million, what do you any thoughts on the Electoral College?
Well, there's actually a CMC angle to this. In the 2000 election, after Bush won narrowly the electoral vote, but clearly lost the popular vote, two of our students, Dave Enrich and Matt Grossman, started a website trying to get Bush electors to flip. They got national publicity for that effort. And both of them gone on to spectacular careers. Matt Grossman is a political scientist. I'm using his book in one of my classes. Dave Enrich, New York Times reporter, has a terrific book out about Deutsche Bank. That particular effort didn't succeed, in part because electors are chosen for their loyalty to the party. So I suspect Democrats would urge Trump electors to flip, but they're not going to do it. You get to be an elector by being a party warhorse. However, that would increase the sentiment to change the Electoral College. That's probably not going to happen anytime soon, given the constitutional impediments. It takes 2/3 vote in each chamber, 3/4 of the state legislatures, unless there is a very substantial change in the composition of Congress. That's not going to happen anytime soon. Now there is an electoral vote compact, which is sort of an end run around this. But again, given the composition of state legislatures, I wouldn't put a lot of money on that. But I think in the long run, you're going to see increasing sentiment for a direct popular vote.
Jack, we have a candidate for U.S. Senate. Any comments on Governor Steve Bullock running for the U.S. Senate in Montana?
I think he would have made a hell of a president. Okay, I admit it. I'm biased. I was his thesis advisor. And I was disappointed that the presidential campaign didn't go anywhere. I think he has a very good chance. Initially, when he announced he was running for the Senate, I thought he was going to be a real underdog. Steve Daines is the incumbent. Daines hasn't done anything spectacularly bad that would provide an obvious attack point, but the dynamics of the election have changed in a couple of ways that favor Steve's chances. Number one, I think the overall environment does work to the benefit of Democrats across the board. Again, asterisk attached to that, a lot of uncertainty to any kind of prediction, but I think it looks like Democrats are going to have a very good year. So that's number one. Number two, if you look at his performance during this crisis, it's been very, very strong. Governors, not all, but a lot of governors are really stepping up to the plate. Mike DeWine, Republican Ohio, has done a terrific job. Andrew Cuomo's doing a good job in New York. Steve's done a really good job in Montana, and what's got him some national attention was his very vigorous advocacy right to Donald Trump in a conference call talking about the shortage of masks. That got a lot of attention, and Democrats were cheering him for being very assertive in a situation in which people aren't very assertive most of the time. So I think I can't guarantee he's going to win, but I think he has a really good chance, and a much better chance than he would have had even a few weeks ago.
Thanks, Jack. We have a question from Elliot Freifeld. Elliot, I am unmuting you. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Since he was a candidate and through his latest health report, Donald Trump's health prognosis has been excellent. Do we have any reason to doubt this or any factual evidence looking at this man that this perhaps might not be completely factual?
I'm shocked that you the note of skepticism. Trump's level of candor, shall we say, has been controversial. And the doctor who issued his health report in the 2016 campaign later admitted that Trump himself actually wrote it. You probably saw pictures of that doctor. He looks like the Big Lebowski. I think there's a great deal we don't know. I caution people who are looking at Twitter. There's a lot of speculation about cognitive decline. You know, Trump messing up certain words in his public addresses. Every public speaker does this. In fact, if you look at the recording of this, I'm sure you could find words I've messed up in the past hour. So I wouldn't put a lot of emphasis on that. But he is a man of a certain age. He's very much overweight. He doesn't really exercise. And people in that condition can see their health go south really fast. Joe Biden, on the other hand, is also in reasonably good health. But again, he looks his age. And as I said before, this makes the selection of a vice presidential candidate very important. So if I had 5 minutes with Joe Biden to advise him, I'd say, all the stuff about partisan, about ideological, geographical, and demographic balance is nice, but the number one thing you ought to consider is, can this person credibly do a job as president on day one? That's by far the most important thing. If Biden picks somebody about whom there is doubt, that will backfire very badly on him. Just look what happened to Sarah Palin in the 2008 campaign, Dan Quayle in 1988, and most spectacularly, Tom Eagleton on the Democratic side in 1972. So my advice to Biden is just vet the hell out of vice presidential candidates and pick the person who can actually serve as president on day one if need be.
We have a final question. It's kind of a two-parter before we're out of time. The first is, do you think Pence would be replaced on the VP ticket? And then the more altruistic one is from a Republican who would like to know how they can find a candidate they believe in that really can bring the country and the party together.
Okay, good questions. Number one, there's been some speculation about replacing Pence. I doubt that. Pence has been getting very good marks for his public presentations, much better than Trump, which of course Trump presents, but that won't be sufficient for Trump to replace him on the ticket. I couldn't think of a good reason for Trump to replace him on the ticket. So I think unless he visibly and clearly messes up with coronavirus, I think he stays. Number two, for Republicans in the future, look to governors. Look to people who are focusing on governance, doing a solid job, and there are some. Mike DeWine, again, gotten very good marks as governor of Ohio. Perhaps he would not be realistic as a presidential candidate, but you do have other governors, other people in executive positions who are stepping up and trying to do the best they can under difficult circumstances, and those people are future leaders.
All right, Andrew Lee has promised a very quick question, so I'll let Andrew have the next one.
Professor Pitney, super quick question on this. How do you think this is going to change for Americans' perception of like the FDA or other healthcare areas, especially since that's a pretty important part of our society? How do we think about that? How's it going to change in the future?
I think it's a great question. Number one, people are paying a lot more attention. I think a few weeks ago, most people had never heard of the CDC or the FDA. Lots just going to depend on performance. If the FDA approves medications that can actually be effective in reducing the symptoms of coronavirus, I think it will get good marks. But if people perceive it as messing up, if we continue to have a shortage of masks, I think people are going to have a more negative opinion of organizations such as the CDC. But again, as with the political community more generally, a lot's just going to depend on results.
Thank you, Professor Pitney. There was one or two questions I couldn't get to, so my apologies, but Professor Pitney does have to go teach, I think, 2 courses this morning and this afternoon, so we will let him go. A big thanks from all of us, the alumni, the parents, and of course the college, to you, Jack, and also to all of you for giving up an hour of your day today. If you want to put any feedback, give us any feedback, please put that in the chat feature for future events and activities. Especially how we conduct these in the future. I'm going to unmute everybody and everyone can say their thanks and say goodbye and have a great day. Be healthy, be safe.
In our old neighborhood.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Good day, everyone.
Thank you.
I see you.
Very nostalgic.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye, John.
Bye, Jack. Professor, good morning.
Bye, John.
You know, ask for
Hang up.
You may want to unshare your screen.
Okay.
There we go. Thanks everybody for continuing to add feedback. We're still here. We'll leave the chat room open for a little bit.
Linda, how do I hang up on this thing? How do I hang up on this?
Good job, everyone. I'm going to jump to the 75th call, but Laura, can you handle the data and the chat saving?
Bet.
I'm going to stop the recording.
And I'm gonna mute everyone back up, but if you want to unmute and have a conversation, just say hello in the chat.
Okay, I have to jump on to the 75th. I'll call you in like an hour.
Great. Thanks, you guys.
Bye.